So as Jim explained, my contributions today are divided into two parts. And first, this morning, I want to speak to you somewhat more briefly, and I'll speak a little bit more at more length after the tea break. But this morning, I just want to speak to you first about the background to the research, the methodology, so you kind of understand where the results are coming from almost, and then a little bit around the policy framework, which is, I suppose, behind social farming, behind the development and the current interest in social farming. So, obviously, a lot of activity, as Jim would have said in his presentation earlier, a lot of activity took place in social farming from a period in Ireland from, let's say, the mid-2000 onwards. And research was done around that kind of activity. And Avian Walsh, who's here today, would have been very much involved in that. But there was a need for, I suppose, that to be ongoing, and a continuing need for a robust body of evidence to inform public policy on the development of social farming, to make the argument, I suppose, for social farming. Why should it be funded? Why should it be supported? And also to influence the long-term commissioning of supports, because we'll return to this theme again and again today. There's, as the results of the research will show, and as you'll hear from our contributors today, the arguments for social farming are really, really strong. There's strong goodwill towards it. People are really sold, I think, on the benefits of it, but it's how do we get it supported in the long term? How do we mainstream it? How do we ensure that there is a real choice available to many people around the country who would benefit from it? So that's sort of what the research is partly about. So in late 2016 then, Leitrim Development Company, in collaboration with UCD, they were granted funding by the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, as Anna Marie referred to earlier, for a project to identify social farming models of best practice and to document the lessons learned. So a researcher would be employed to carry out a national level study with a variety of social farms, with a wide range of participants and services throughout 2017. Now, my predecessor, Dr. Gail Cummins, unfortunately Gail can't be here with us today, but Gail worked on this project up until August last year, and she would have done very much the setup of it and set a lot of the research out and would have done the initial stages of the research, and then I would have taken over last August, initially on a part-time basis, but now on a full-time basis. So, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge Gail's work on this project, very much so, because, as I said, she made it very easy for me to come into it and to take over. So, what was the methodology then for the project? Well, a national level study, which is really important, as you'll have learned from Jim earlier. Social farming to that date, the kind of social farming model we're talking about here would have been very much regional, I suppose. It would have been, largely concentrated in the northwest of the country. So this was a national level study which would document the social farming that was taking place all over the country. So that was exciting in itself, because even in a country as small as Ireland, we can see practice can, vary widely, and we've all sorts of different types of farms. The type of farming you'd find in the northwest, very different to what you might find in a Kilkenny or a Cork or, a Wexford. So that was interesting in itself, different types of farms. And what we really wanted to get was a robust sample of the placements that would have taken place in 2017. And this, I think, we very much managed to do when you see the figures here. So the research involved 54 participants on 15 farms from a range of sectors. So if you take it, I think we had something like 140 participants in total last year. So 54 is a really good, strong, for anyone who's interested in research, anyone geeky enough to be interested in research, that's, that would be considered a very good sample. And we would have had 31 farms, so nearly half of the farms. So in terms of sectors then, I suppose we wanted to make sure we got a good wide range of sectors. So participants came from, the two main, I suppose, would be intellectual disability and mental health. And I suppose the logic behind that is that those would have been the sectors we would have been most comfortable with, have developed the strongest relationships with over the period of like the SOFAB project and before that. So they're also, I suppose, some of the most logical sectors in which you'll imagine people to come to. But I don't want to give the impression that that's the whole story. We also would have 4 participants from the youth sector, one of whom is with us here today and who you'll be listening to in the fireside chat. And then we would have had 8 participants coming from what we're calling the long-term unemployed sector. But again, there would have been, obviously other people would have also taken part in placements around the country, but those were the 4 key subgroups we focused on for this research. But this is not to say that there isn't huge potential to go beyond that, and that's something we'll be looking at in the future. So each social farm then within our research project as such delivered social farming to between 1 and 4 participants. There was only one farm on which we had 1 participant. Most would be between sort of 2 and 3. And 3 seems to be almost the magic number when it comes, and that's something we might talk about a little bit about later as well when it comes to numbers of participants. Usually 1 day per week, in some cases 2, but usually 1 day per week, and for a minimum of 8 to 12 weeks. This map isn't of the most fantastic quality, but there's a better version of it, I suppose, in your 4-pager of results that you'll have got this morning. But you can see there the regional spread, and again, just to slightly explain, there is a bit of an over-concentration, I suppose you would say, perhaps in that northwest to the border region. Again, the reason for that is that that's where a lot of the farmers that we'd previously worked with were based and up and running. But as I said, we did have farmers from every region within the country. As you may be aware, obviously, we work closely. Leitrim Development Company is where the national office is based and where that region is based as such. But then we have our 3 other regional development workers, one based in West Limerick Resources, one based in Waterford Leader Partnership, and one based in Southwest Mayo Development Company. So, they would have, been our key linkages in terms of developing those placement farms. So the methodology then, just to take you briefly through it, again, I think it's important we know, when we talk about results, where are these results coming from, that we're not just sort of pulling them out of the air or relying on instinct or intuitiveness or a feeling we get from a farm, but, that there's a very strong evidence base here. So first, in relation to the participants then, participants would have been interviewed at the end of placements, some cases in collaboration with their support worker, in some cases not. Depending again, their kind of capacity and confidence and all of that. We very much took our cue from how they wanted to do it. In some cases, Teresa will have already referred to this, particularly in the case of people coming from the mental health sector, we would have the use of OT assessment tools. Observations by the researcher on the farm. You learned a huge amount just by being there, watching the interactions with people. Very hard to capture the crack, the fun, the banter, the talk about the football match the day before, in an OT assessment tool or in any kind of a strict interview schedule or something, but it was very much there to see. And so the observation process was really important. And as part of that process, myself and Gail before me would have, in some cases, joined in with tasks if it was kind of opportune. But we tried to stay as long as we could, have it as relaxed a day as possible when we were there, without wanting to interfere, of course, obviously with the essential business of getting on with social farming. We're always very anxious not to, I suppose, over-monitor it, that the participants should just experience it as a relaxed day and not as if they're being overly monitored in terms of what they're doing. I'll refer to this a bit later again, and that's part of the joy of social farming and something I know that the support workers and the services would be very, very anxious to maintain, that naturalness, that ease. The farmers keep a logbook. Again, it's another key part of the process. Farmers keep a logbook in which they detail what happens each day, things like did someone come onto the farm, what activities, what worked, what didn't work. And again, it's interesting to read those and see the progression that happens from maybe the first day of the placement to the last day of the placement. In some cases, participants would have themselves kept diaries of their progress, and interesting to be able to read those and to see the commentary on those, and in some cases the likes of scrapbooks as well. So for the farmers then, we would have interviewed farmers at the beginning of their social farming journey and at the end of the placement. Again, the farmer logs books and the observations would be another kind of key element as well, watching how the farmer interacts with the participants. Service providers, then we would have interviewed a total of 26 service providers. The reason there is, we don't have a match service provider for each participant is because obviously, as you can imagine, a lot of service providers, support workers would have been there to support 2 or more participants. So they, again, would be interviewed at the beginning and at the end of the placements. And we would have held a couple of focus groups at the beginning with a sample of support workers as well. So it's a really, as you can see, as a study, there's, we're not just relying on one source of information, just interviews. There's, a strong element of, I suppose, I always talk when I talk about social farming about the holistic nature of it, and that holistic nature had to be reflected in the methodology as well. That we weren't just focusing on one thing or relying on one source, that we looked with all of our senses almost, and we observed it and all of that as well. So that is really, really important. And I hope, we have a really robust body of data now. We've begun the process of mining it, and I'm presenting you with kind of really good preliminary results today, but there's certainly more there to be discovered within that data. that will hopefully capture that holistic nature. So as I said, it's been a largely qualitative study with some, very much about telling people stories, quotes, all of that sort of thing. But there are obviously some quantitative elements. With 54 participants, you are able to do some level of statistical analysis, which is terrific to have. As I said, we have a very rich bank of data. Ethical considerations, as you can imagine, very much to the fore in a study such as this, because we're dealing in a lot of cases with people who are vulnerable, and the ethics of it has to be really, really watertight. So just there's detailed information available on this if anyone would like to see it, but just to very quickly highlight some of the things, we would have an ethical oversight committee which stands over the research, ethical approval from a wide range of the relevant organisations that we needed to go to. Obviously we obtained voluntary and informed consent from all participants in the research, and Teresa's already referred to this, the importance of the anonymity and confidentiality. Well, confidentiality obviously in terms of people's name, but no one is identified obviously by name or anything like that in the study. So all of those sort of measures were taken to protect people's privacy and confidentiality. So what's the current status of the research anyway? The analysis of the data has been carried out to a certain level and to quite a high level. We've had a preliminary report, which Anna Marie referred to earlier, to Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. That happened there just last month, beginning of last month. So currently we've looked at the findings from 3 key perspectives, and that's what I'll be talking about later in the morning: the participants, the farmers and the service providers. And we've had some dissemination of materials, obviously the likes of the 4-pager that you have here today, the presentation here at the conference. We have our results posters which are out there in the lobby. So the work is really ongoing to mine this rich set of data, and of particular relevance, and this is why I'm mentioning it specifically here this morning. I know we have a lot of service providers here this morning, and I know a lot of you maybe are very well disposed towards the idea of social farming, but you want evidence. You want to be able to go back to your boss or your boss's boss or your boss's boss's boss and say, this works, this can work for people who use our service. So one of the things I will be progressing really quickly, as soon as this kind of conference is over, maybe not this afternoon, but certainly next week and in the weeks after, is to produce a set of papers for each subgroup that we've worked with, which will be very much orientated, will contain targeted and specific analysis and recommendations for that, very much orientated towards that particular service, because they are quite different. The youth sector is quite different to the mental health sector, and the intellectual disability is quite different, and the needs are different, the needs of participants are different, the levels of progression you can expect are different, all of that sort of thing. So I will be progressing that as soon as possible, because I know some people are really anxious to get their hands on that kind of material, and it will be done in as user-friendly nature as possible, and really get to the heart of the matter as quickly as possible. Again, I think all of you want, you don't want to have to wade through 60 or 80 pages of material to get to know what benefit is this going to be to my service, how can I make this work in my service. So that is priority for me in the coming months. So I will be back to many of you in relation to that. So I also want to make the point that, that this is a sort of a rolling contract, so the research process is ongoing and will be an ongoing journey over the coming years, and there's lots of, potentially exciting areas in which we could do research, and your input is very much sought into that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So the policy context then, Jim has made some reference to it, and Teresa as well indeed, and Anne-Marie, but I just want to give you a little bit of idea of where the particular model, I suppose, we talk of social farming that we're kind of talking about here today has evolved from, and where it sits indeed, because I'm not making the argument that it's the end point of a process, but rather it's part of a whole family, I suppose, of approaches. So there's a strong tradition of institutional farms in Ireland, attached to maybe in the first instance the likes of monasteries, residential care homes, rehabilitation centres. In the past, perhaps those were for very practical as well as therapeutic reasons. You would have had places that would have literally fed themselves almost from the farm work that was going on them, and people who were maybe, part of a service or whatever would have taken part in that. That tradition continues today to extent with the practical bit perhaps taken out of it to a certain extent, and now very much the focus on the therapeutic aspect of it. And we still see, some what we would call no negative connotation of the word institutional, but we're talking about farms that would be on the likes of the Camphill communities, Coonvera, Belmont Park Farm, places like that. So that's kind of one model in itself, and we're very much part of that tradition as well. Any of you, I suppose, you just from your own lives and from just reading media, there's been a really growing interest, I think, in this whole idea of nature as therapy, what is often referred to as green care. So within that we have things like social and therapeutic horticulture, animal assisted therapy. Some of our social farmers indeed are very much involved in that whole idea of equine assisted therapy. And nature therapy, community gardens. The latest one I've heard lately is forest bathing. That's another one that, all falls within that broad idea of, I'll explain to you later what it is if anyone's interested. But this whole idea of, I suppose, just, that modern society is tough on us in terms of, our overall sense of well-being, be it mental, physical, spiritual indeed. So, the contribution that nature and being in nature can have to improving our sense of ourselves and getting us back to a place we want to be. So, but much of the recent development of social farming in Ireland, I suppose the model we're talking about here today, the model upon which the research is based, is focused on use of the typical working family farm, which is still so key in Irish society. I think we almost don't realise how much that is still very much part. Ireland is still, while the numbers have declined rapidly indeed of farmers, it is still very much, I suppose, at the heart of rural Ireland, and we still have those very strong that strong farming community, a lot of farms, smaller farms, within which exist huge assets, human assets, beautiful landscapes, lovely farm buildings, animal, things which can tap into, I suppose, a whole range of people's needs. So, as I said, we're very much want to kind of highlight that, I suppose, and I suppose valorise it and validate it. So, obviously, we've already referred to this, it's where small numbers benefit from individualised support in a non-clinical environment, with a strong emphasis on a person-centred approach, community connections and social inclusion. I suppose this is the idea of people going out from a service, rather out of a service and onto a farm, rather than into another service. So it's that kind of idea of getting out there into the community and what that means to people. So again, it's the ordinary things in ordinary places. In terms of some of the, I suppose, the key drivers in terms of the policy context then, we've had the strong emergence of a social model of disability rather than a medical model of disability, based things like person-centred principles, community inclusion, a strong feeling that there's a need for a change in culture and practice and services, where people don't just necessarily go in and spend a week in a service, but that they are very much part of a community, part of a rural area. Within mental health services then, we have, going back to a vision for change in 2006, a strong emphasis on a holistic view of mental illness, on maximising recovery and facilitating meaningful integration and participation in community life. And just in general, I suppose, in an awful lot of social inclusion work, and even in the likes of the SciCap programme and that, the idea of a person-centred progressive approach, coming up with people, not saying to people, oh, you should do this, you should do that, working with where people are at, what they want to do, what floats their boat, what do they yearn to do, what might engage their interest. Because if you do that, then all sorts of great things can happen from that, if you're working from a place where you're developing a pre-existing interest, a pre-existing yearning in some cases. Obviously, we have our kind of recent consultation process and hopefully strong moves in terms of this whole idea of providing more individualised and personalised budgets for people within the health and social care sector. And the likes, this is very key indeed to the development of social farming in the future, where we can kind of release those funds, I suppose, and enable people to make that choice to do social farming. From the kind of rural development farming side then, of course, we've had this shift really from a productivist towards a more of a multifunctional agricultural regime, with increased recognition, I suppose, that, producing, vegetables or rearing cattle is only one element of what a farmer provides in the wider kind of rural development, rural economic landscape. And within that context then, social farming can be seen as an activity which will, in the first instance, widen the farmer's income source. Most of the farmers we speak about assemble their income from a range of sources, and there's a real level of entrepreneurialism in that, almost in having to try that and assemble that, and social farming can be an element of that. Obviously fostering kind of rural development and contributing to reconnecting farming and wider society. Again, a really important thing. I think we would all have the feeling that farming would have been much more embedded in the past, perhaps. People would have gone maybe to work on the farm for a day if the harvest was coming in, or the farmer was themselves going into the creamery, all of that sort of thing. Whereas farming had become, I suppose, a much more isolated, individualised activity. And so, social farming kind of reopens that space, I suppose. And then the kind of stimulus and learning provided by the EU-funded support programs in the last decade, like SOFAR and SOFAB, that they've provided that sort of impetus, that learning, that we've kind of got the set of procedures now. We sort of know what we're doing, and we're just kind of really just want to now mainstream it and get it out as much as possible and throughout the country. So that's me for this morning. As I said, I will come back later on this morning with more on the results. So just that hopefully will have given you a little bit of background into where those results came from and why indeed we're why we think social farming is sort of here to stay in the kind of policy context within that. So thank you very much.